I grew up in a house where freedom wasn't an abstract word. It was lived day by day through the life and sacrifice of my father. He was a veteran who never came back from his final deployment. For us, his memory lived on in the simplest of things: his old boots left by the door, the folded flag that once draped his coffin, and the oak tree he planted with his own hands before he left. That tree was more than wood and leaves. It was my father's legacy. He dug the soil himself, laughing as he pressed the young roots into the earth, saying, "One day this tree will give shade to your children's children." After he was gone, we decorated its trunk with a small bronze plaque engraved with his name, his rank, and the dates of his service. Every Memorial Day, neighbors left flowers at its base. Every 4th of July, we hung a flag from its strongest branch. For nearly 20 years, that oak stood tall in our front yard, a living monument to a man who gave everything for this country. But to the HOA, it was just an unsightly tree. The first letter arrived on a Monday morning, slipped neatly into our mailbox between bills and grocery coupons. Notice of violation, unauthorized structure. Tree must be removed within 30 days to maintain community aesthetic standards. I read the words twice, my hands trembling, my heart pounding in disbelief. Unauthorized structure. This wasn't a swing set or a rusty shed. This was my father's memorial. I called the HOA office immediately, voice tight with controlled anger. That oak tree was planted by my father before he died serving this country, I told them. It is not coming down. On the other end of the line, the HOA president, an immaculately smug woman named Deborah, sighed the way bureaucrats sigh when they know their power shields them from empathy. "We all appreciate your father's service," she said coolly, "but the rules apply equally to everyone. The tree violates Article 7 of the Landscaping Covenant. If it's not removed, fines will begin at $100 per day." It felt like a slap in the face, not just to me, but to my father's memory. Neighbors whispered their support, but lowered their eyes whenever Deborah's white Lexus rolled down the street. They knew better than to cross her. Fines could cripple a family. Liens could take your home. Fear was the HOA's most reliable weapon. Still, I refused. I tended that tree with the same care my father once gave to us. I watered it, trimmed its branches, polished the plaque at its base until it gleamed in the sun. Each morning when I looked out my kitchen window, I felt as if my father was still standing guard. But Deborah and her board weren't finished. The second notice was harsher. Failure to comply will result in HOA action to restore community standards. It didn't just threaten fines, it threatened removal by authorized contractors. That phrase echoed in my head like a warning shot. Removal by authorized contractors. What they meant was simple. They were coming for my father's tree. And as I stood on my porch, the evening light casting long shadows across the lawn, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about one tree. It was about power, about a board that believed no sacrifice, not even the blood of a soldier, could stand taller than their bylaws. And so the battle began. The night it happened was strangely quiet, the kind of silence that feels wrong, like the air itself is holding its breath. I had just put away the dinner dishes when I noticed the faint glow of headlights at the end of the cul-de-sac. At first, I thought it was a neighbor coming home late, but the engine didn't turn off. Instead, the rumble grew louder, and soon a flatbed truck rolled slowly past my house, idling in front of the oak. Two men jumped out, wearing reflective vests. They carried chainsaws. My stomach dropped. I stepped out onto the porch, my phone clutched tight in my hand. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted into the night. One of the men didn't even look at me. He swung the saw off his shoulder, pulled the cord, and the blade roared to life. The sound tore through the quiet like a scream. "This is authorized by the HOA, the other man called back, his tone casual, rehearsed. "We've got orders. Authorized." I could barely hear my own voice over the chainsaw. "That tree is a memorial to my father. You can't touch it." But they could, and they did. The blade bit into the trunk, spewing sawdust into the air like sparks. I ran forward, tears stinging my eyes, but one of them stepped between me and the tree, raising his arm as if I were the one breaking the law. "Ma'am, you'll want to step back. This is for your own safety, for my safety." As if cutting down my father's memory was some kind of public service. I wanted to throw myself in front of the trunk, to wrap my arms around it like a shield, but I froze. Maybe it was shock, maybe fear, but I just stood there, trembling, my phone recording everything as the chainsaw screamed through the night. The oak groaned as the cut deepened. I could hear it cracking from within, the fibers snapping like bones breaking. And then, in one sickening moment, the tree lurched sideways and collapsed onto the lawn with a thud that shook the earth. The plaque I had polished that very morning flew loose and skittered across the grass. The bronze caught the glow of the headlights before disappearing into the dirt. The men cut the trunk into sections as if it were just firewood, loading the heavy logs onto the truck bed. When they were done, nothing remained but a scarred stump and a trail of sawdust blowing in the breeze. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone steady. My voice cracked as I whispered into the camera, "They killed it. They killed my father's tree." By the time the truck pulled away, leaving ruts in the grass, neighbors had begun to emerge from their houses. Mrs. Patterson from across the street clutched her robe around her shoulders, her eyes wide. A young couple next door stood silently, one of them raising a phone to record. Nobody spoke at first. We all just stared at the empty space where the oak had stood, as though refusing to believe it was gone. And then someone muttered, "They went too far." The word spread like wildfire down the street. "Too far," another voice said. "This isn't right." By morning, the video I uploaded had reached thousands. Strangers messaged me from all over the country. Some were veterans, some were children of veterans, all furious that an HOA could dare to destroy a living memorial. Comments poured in, "That tree was sacred. This is un-American. They need to be held accountable." News vans showed up before noon. A reporter stood in my yard with a microphone, pointing to the stump as the camera zoomed in on the shredded remains of the roots. She asked me what the tree had meant. My throat tightened, but I managed to say, "It was my father's promise, and now they've broken it." The HOA released a statement later that day, claiming they were simply enforcing landscaping guidelines and that no disrespect was intended. But their cold, bureaucratic words only fueled the fire. The image of that stump, raw and jagged, spread faster than any press release could contain. By the second night, veterans groups had begun to call. They wanted to come. They wanted to stand in my yard where the oak had fallen and show the HOA what community really means. And I realized then this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was about every soldier whose memory had ever been bulldozed by arrogance. Every family who'd been told by a clipboard and a fine that their sacrifice didn't matter. The battle for my father's tree was about to become something much bigger. By the weekend, my front yard looked less like a suburban lawn and more like a rallying point. At first, it was just a few neighbors leaving small bouquets where the oak had once stood. Then came the flags, dozens of them. American flags planted into the earth around the stump, their colors snapping in the wind like defiance itself. The first veterans arrived on Saturday morning. They didn't announce themselves, they didn't need to. I opened the door to find 3 men in worn leather jackets, their patches stitched with names of wars past: Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan. They stood silently for a moment, caps in their hands, eyes fixed on the stump. Then one of them, an older man with steel-gray hair and a limp in his step, saluted. "My brothers deserve better than this," he said. His voice carried the weight of decades. Word spread faster than I could keep up. By noon, a dozen veterans stood in my yard. By evening, there were nearly 50. Some came with walkers, others with wheelchairs, still others in pressed uniforms that hadn't seen daylight in years. Each carried with them a quiet fury that needed no explanation. Local reporters swarmed the street, capturing every angle, the flags, the salutes, the tears. But it was the veterans' silence that struck the loudest chord. They didn't shout, they didn't chant, they simply stood there, forming a line of honor before a scarred stump. The HOA tried to ignore it at first. Their office was just a few blocks away, a sterile brick building with tinted windows and a polished sign that read Willow Creek Community Association. On Monday morning, Deborah, the president, pulled into the lot in her white Lexus, pretending not to notice the line of veterans waiting outside. Cameras caught her anyway, her sunglasses reflecting the flags waving in the background. When a reporter asked for comment, she sniffed. "This is a landscaping issue, nothing more." But nothing about it felt small anymore. By Tuesday, the crowd had doubled. A bus rolled in from a neighboring town, unloading veterans who had never set foot in our community but knew an injustice when they saw one. They carried banners, "Respect our fallen, honor their memory." I watched from my porch as the scene grew. A lump in my throat so heavy it nearly choked me. My father's face flashed in my mind, his crooked grin, the way he used to call me kiddo. He had fought in wars oceans away, and yet here in this quiet little town his legacy was under siege, and somehow, even in death, he had rallied an army. That evening, a town hall meeting was scheduled at the community center. Normally, these meetings were sleepy affairs, a handful of homeowners arguing over fence heights and paint colors. But when I walked through those doors, the air practically crackled. Veterans filled the seats, their medals gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, clutching signs and folded flags. Deborah sat at the front, flanked by her board, their expressions tight with irritation. She cleared her throat, adjusted her pearl necklace, and began reading from a prepared statement about enforcing community standards. That's when Tom Henderson, the veteran with the steel-gray hair, rose from his chair. His voice was calm, but it carried like thunder. "Ma'am," he said, "that tree wasn't a weed, it wasn't clutter, it was a memorial. And when you cut it down, you didn't just break a rule, you broke faith with every soldier who ever laid down his life so people like you could sit in this room and wield authority." The applause that followed was deafening. Even the walls seemed to vibrate. Deborah tried to gavel the room to order. But the sound was swallowed by a chorus of voices. "Respect the fallen, respect the fallen." I sat there, my hands trembling, realizing the fight had crossed a line. This was no longer about fines or landscaping. This was a moral reckoning, a community divided between power and principle, and for once principle was winning. That night, as the crowd poured out of the community center, I overheard a neighbor whisper to another, "They don't stand a chance against this." And for the first time since the chainsaw split the night, I allowed myself to believe she might be right. By Wednesday morning, the story had leapt beyond our little town. What began as a single video on my phone, grainy footage of chainsaws ripping through the night, had become a headline splashed across national news sites. HOA cuts down veteran memorial tree. The words felt surreal, as though my grief had been distilled into a soundbite for millions to consume. Cable news anchors debated it over coffee mugs. Radio hosts raged about suburban tyranny. Even late-night comedians worked it into their monologues, mocking the idea that a homeowners association thought itself powerful enough to erase a veteran's memory with a landscaping rule. But the raw power wasn't in the headlines, it was in the comments, thousands of them, some short, some long, but all carrying the same note of outrage. "My father served, my husband never came home. My son is buried under a white cross in Arlington, and if anyone touched his memorial, I would burn down the HOA office myself." The clip of Tom Henderson speaking at the town hall went especially viral. His voice, steady, weathered, unshakable, reminded people of an America that stood tall even in the face of arrogance. Within hours, veteran groups from across the country began organizing, promising to send delegations, offering legal help, raising money for our fight. When I pulled up my email that night, it overflowed with messages. A Gold Star mother from Texas wrote, "They dishonored your father's tree, but you've reminded us all that we must protect each other's memories. You are not alone." The HOA board, of course, tried damage control. They issued a second statement, this one laced with legal jargon and condescension. The removal of unauthorized landscaping was carried out in accordance with community covenants. The board regrets any misunderstanding and encourages residents to respect the democratic process of HOA governance. But their words fell flat against the image of the stump. That jagged, brutal reminder could not be polished with press releases. The pressure only mounted when a state legislator from our district weighed in. His post on social media was simple but devastating. No HOA rule should ever override the memory of a fallen soldier. Period. It was shared tens of thousands of times. Suddenly, this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute, it was a political issue. By Friday, news vans lined the block like a convoy. Their antennas pierced the sky, satellite dishes angled upward, beaming our grief across the nation. Reporters camped on my lawn, some crouching by the stump, tracing their fingers along its rough surface as if trying to translate the language of loss into the cadence of a segment. My mother, who had kept to herself since the night the oak fell, finally stepped onto the porch. Cameras turned instantly, microphones thrust forward. She didn't raise her voice, didn't deliver a speech. She simply held up the bronze plaque that had once been at the tree's base, the one I had found half buried in the dirt. Her words were soft, but they carried more weight than any headline. "This was my husband's name, you can't erase him." The footage spread like wildfire, commentators wept on air. Veterans called into radio shows, their voices breaking as they described the memorials they tended in their own towns. And then the stories began surfacing across the country. Families started sharing their own HOA battles, flags ordered down, memorial benches dismantled, service dogs banned. Each story fed into the next, forming a mosaic of quiet oppression that had gone unnoticed until now. Our town was simply the spark. By Sunday morning, the governor's office had called. They wanted a meeting. As I hung up the phone, I looked out across the yard. Veterans still stood watch, their flags planted firm. Neighbors walked by with casseroles. Coffee and hugs, children laid drawings on the stump, crayon-colored sketches of oaks reaching skyward with American flags flying from their branches. The HOA might have thought they'd cut down one tree, but in truth, they had awakened a forest. By Monday morning, the fight had moved from the streets to the courts. The American Legion had dispatched a team of attorneys, seasoned men and women who had spent their careers defending veterans' rights. They arrived not with banners or chants, but with briefcases and ironclad resolve. I met them in my living room, where the coffee table was buried beneath stacks of letters, violation notices, and the HOA's smug correspondence. One lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Hale, flipped through the papers with the precision of a surgeon. After a few minutes, she leaned back and said, "They've hung themselves." I blinked. "What do you mean?" She tapped the first notice. Calling a memorial tree an unauthorized structure is absurd enough, but here, she pulled another letter forward, this threat of removal without homeowner consent, that's a direct violation of state property law. And combined with the fact that this tree was clearly dedicated to a veteran, they've also run afoul of the Veterans Memorial Preservation Act. That's federal. We're not just talking about fines anymore, we're talking criminal liability. Her words felt like a bomb and a dagger at once, relief that we had a path forward, fury that it had to come to this. By noon, the suit had been filed in federal court, Rodriguez Family v. Willow Creek HOA. News broke within the hour, every network carried it, their headlines blistering. Veterans Memorial Tree sparks federal case against HOA. The pressure was crushing and cracks began to show inside the board itself. That evening, while veterans still stood vigil at the stump, one of my neighbors slipped quietly onto my porch. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting Deborah to appear from the shadows. I can't stay silent anymore, he whispered. His name was Alan, a junior board member who had always voted with the majority, too timid to resist Deborah's iron grip. She ordered the removal personally, he confessed, voice shaking. We didn't vote on it, she didn't even consult us. She just waived a contract and said it was within her authority. Some of us disagreed, but he swallowed hard. She said anyone who opposed her would regret it. I felt my jaw clench, and now. He looked toward the cameras parked along the curb, then back at me. Now I see what it cost, I want to help. The next day, Alan's resignation letter hit the press. In it, he accused Deborah of ruling like a dictator, bypassing procedure, fabricating violations, and silencing dissent. The board tried to spin it as the rant of a disgruntled member, but the damage was done. Reporters smelled blood. Deborah doubled down. She called an emergency press conference outside the HOA office, flanked by the two remaining loyalists. Her pearls gleamed under the sun as she declared, "This is a witch hunt. We acted within our legal rights. This family is exploiting their tragedy for attention." But as she spoke, a group of veterans unfurled a massive American flag directly behind her. Cameras pivoted, capturing the image that would plaster front pages the next morning, a woman in pearls shouting into microphones while a sea of veterans stood in silent judgment behind her. The tide had turned, and she knew it. That night, my phone rang again. This time it was Rebecca, the attorney. Her voice was steady. Almost electric, the judge granted our motion for an emergency injunction. Effective immediately, the HOA is forbidden from further actions against your property. And there's more, he ordered them to appear in federal court within 30 days to answer for the destruction of the memorial. I sank into my chair, the weight of weeks of grief and fury crashing into me all at once. For the first time, the scales felt like they were tipping toward justice. Outside, the veterans had lit candles around the stump, their glow flickering against the night. From my window, it looked less like a yard and more like hallowed ground, a place where memory refused to be erased. And I realized the HOA hadn't just lost the legal battle, they'd lost the community. The federal courthouse stood like a fortress of stone and glass, its steps crowded with cameras and microphones. By the time I arrived, veterans had already formed a corridor on either side, saluting as my family walked past. Reporters shouted questions, flashes burst like fireworks, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Inside, the air was taut, the kind of silence that buzzes with anticipation. The courtroom was packed, neighbors, journalists. Fellow veterans, on one side sat Deborah and her dwindling board, her pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her lips pressed into a line so tight it looked carved from stone. On the other, our legal team, calm, prepared, a stack of evidence at the ready. The judge entered, a woman with iron-gray hair and the kind of presence that made the room straighten instantly. She adjusted her glasses, glanced at the docket, and said simply, "We are here to consider allegations under the Veterans Memorial Preservation Act, as well as state and federal property laws. Let's begin." Rebecca, our lead attorney, rose first. She moved with the poise of someone who'd carried cases heavier than this one, but her voice carried fire. "Your Honor, what this board did was not landscaping, it was desecration. This family's memorial was destroyed under cover of night, without consent, without due process, and in direct violation of laws designed to protect the memory of our fallen." Then she played the video. The sound of the chainsaw filled the room, raw and violent. On the screen, the oak trembled, cracked, and fell. My voice could be heard, faint and breaking. "They killed it. They killed my father's tree." You could feel the shift in the room. Neighbors covered their mouths, veterans stiffened in their seats, and even the court stenographer paused, her fingers frozen above the keys. When it ended, the silence was deafening. Deborah's attorney, a polished man in a blue suit, stood next, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, while we regret the emotional impact, the HOA acted within its authority to enforce community covenants. The tree, regardless of sentiment, violated landscaping rules. Violated." The judge cut in, her eyes sharp. "Are you telling me a memorial tree to a fallen veteran was a violation?" The lawyer faltered. We maintain that uniformity in the community aesthetic is essential to property values. The judge leaned forward. Property values, she repeated flatly as if the words tasted foul. Then came the testimonies. Tom Henderson took the stand first, straightening his back like he was back in uniform. His voice shook with age but never with fear. "We buried boys younger than 20 under white crosses overseas," he said. "When you destroy a memorial, you don't just cut wood, you cut memory, you cut respect, and when respect is gone, this country has lost its soul." The courtroom erupted in applause until the judge banged her gavel. Even she couldn't fully hide the glint of respect in her eyes. Neighbors followed, mothers, fathers, kids who left flowers at the oak on Memorial Day. Each one chipped away at the HOA's facade of authority. And then my mother took the stand. She held the bronze plaque in her trembling hands, the one with my father's name, and lifted it for the judge to see. Her voice was barely above a whisper. But every word carried. "This isn't a rule. This isn't a violation. This is my husband," and they threw him in the dirt. There wasn't a dry eye left in the room. By the end of the day, Deborah looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth. The cameras outside would later capture her scowling as she left, shielding her face from the flashing lights, but inside everyone knew the tide had turned. This wasn't just a trial anymore, it was a reckoning. The courthouse testimony had lit a fuse, and by the following morning the explosion was everywhere. The footage of my mother holding the plaque ran on every major network. Newspapers splashed it across their front pages. HOA on trial after destroying veteran memorial. Talk radio seethed, veterans called in by the dozens, their voices breaking as they shared their own stories of disrespect and loss. But the real inferno burned online. Clips from the trial were clipped and reshared, gaining millions of views in hours. Hashtags trended, #RespectOurFallen, #HOA tyranny, #Justice for the Oak. Even celebrities weighed in. A country singer tweeted, "You don't cut down a soldier's tree, period." A retired general appeared on cable news, eyes blazing, declaring, "This is not about landscaping, this is about honor." Meanwhile, the board itself was crumbling. Allen's resignation had been the first crack, but now others followed. On Wednesday, another board member, Karen HOA, a soft-spoken accountant, released her own statement. She admitted the board had been pressured into silence, that Deborah had bypassed votes and falsified minutes. "I stayed quiet out of fear," she wrote, "but silence is complicity. I cannot remain complicit any longer." The media devoured it. One outlet described it as the HOA's Watergate moment. Deborah, cornered but unbowed, tried to claw back control. She held another press conference, this time inside the HOA office, the blinds drawn tight against the crowd chanting outside. She insisted the board had only acted to preserve property values and that emotions were being weaponized against reason. But as she spoke, protesters filled the parking lot, waving flags, holding handmade signs. "Veterans over property values. You can't mow down honor. You call now." The chants of resign, thundered through the glass. Even the local news anchor covering the event live could barely hide her incredulity. "There you have it," she said into the camera, "a president defending property values while her community demands respect." That night, the neighborhood felt transformed. What had once been a quiet grid of beige houses now pulsed with energy. Neighbors who had once whispered their frustrations now spoke loudly, boldly. Veterans walked door to door with petitions for a recall election, explaining to residents that HOA bylaws gave them the power to remove the board with a simple majority. I watched from my porch as people signed, young couples who had just moved in, elderly widows who had been bullied for years, parents who said their children asked why the mean people cut down the hero's tree. One by one, signatures filled the pages. By Friday, nearly 2/3 of the homeowners had signed on. The recall was no longer an idea, it was inevitable. And yet Deborah refused to step down. She sent out glossy mailers, warning residents that without her leadership, property values would plummet. She painted us as agitators, even extremists, threatening the stability of the neighborhood. But her words rang hollow against the sight of veterans holding nightly vigils at the stump, their candles glowing like stars in the darkness. Families brought food, children sang patriotic songs, and neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, united in a way we hadn't been in years. One evening, as the crowd gathered, Tom Henderson leaned toward me. His voice was gravelly but strong. "They thought they could cut down one tree and scare a family. What they really did was wake up a town." He was right. The HOA had ruled through fear for too long, but now the fear was gone. What replaced it was something stronger, deeper: community. And once a community finds its voice, no bylaw, no fine, no smug smile behind tinted sunglasses can silence it again. The recall election was coming, and this time the HOA wouldn't be in control of the vote. The night of the recall meeting, the community center looked less like a suburban clubhouse and more like the stage of a national reckoning. Cars lined every street for blocks. News vans crowded the lot, their satellite dishes pointing skyward. Inside, every chair was filled, neighbors shoulder to shoulder, veterans in their caps and jackets forming a wall of quiet defiance at the back. The board sat at the front table under harsh fluorescent lights, Deborah in her signature pearls. Her face pale but her chin held high. Beside her, the two remaining loyalists shifted nervously, their papers stacked in shaky hands. They looked less like leaders than defendants awaiting sentence. The meeting was called to order, but the gavel's crack was drowned out by the murmur of the crowd. It wasn't anger exactly, it was something heavier, the collective weight of people who had been pushed too far for too long. Alan, the former board member who had broken ranks, stood from the audience. His voice was firm, resolute. Neighbors, tonight we're not just voting on rules or landscaping. We're voting on whether fear still governs this community or whether we take it back. Applause thundered through the hall. Petitions were verified, signatures counted, and then the moment came. Ballots passed from hand to hand, pens scratching against paper as residents marked their choice, keep the board or recall it. The room buzzed with tension. As the votes were tallied, Deborah rose to speak. "You all need to understand," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "Without this board, without me, property values will fall. This hysteria over one tree." The crowd erupted, boos echoing off the cinderblock walls. A veteran shouted from the back, "That tree was worth more than your pearls." Another voice cut through, "You don't own us, Deborah, you never did." The judge overseeing the process banged her gavel for order, but the message was clear. The board had already lost the room. When the final count was read, it wasn't even close. Over 70% voted to recall. Deborah's grip on power had snapped like the trunk of the oak she ordered cut down. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. And then it broke. Cheers, applause, people embracing each other. Veterans stood and saluted. Children waved small flags. Even the judge allowed herself a thin smile as she declared the board dissolved, effective immediately. Deborah's face twisted with rage, but the cameras caught every second of it. The pearls at her throat, the trembling in her hands, the realization that her kingdom of fines and fear was gone. She gathered her papers in a fury and stormed toward the door. Outside, protesters waited. Reporters swarmed. Her white Lexus would carry her away, but not from the stain of disgrace burned into every headline. Inside, something remarkable happened. Neighbors who had barely spoken in years stood together, planning what came next. Tom Henderson raised his hand, voice strong. "We'll rebuild not just the tree, but trust. This is our home and it belongs to us again." Applause roared like thunder. For the first time in years, the community center felt alive, not with rules and reprimands, but with unity. That night, as I walked home past the stump, the vigil still burning bright, I felt something shift deep inside. My father's oak was gone, but its spirit had multiplied. It lived in every flag waving on a porch, in every handshake between neighbors, in every voice that had risen against tyranny and said no more. The HOA had fallen, but the real victory wasn't their defeat. It was the birth of something stronger, a community reborn, and the fight wasn't finished yet. The courtroom still waited, and justice for my father's tree was still to be delivered. The courthouse was packed again, but this time it felt different. The recall had already toppled the board's power in the neighborhood. What remained now was the law's verdict, a reckoning no resignation letter could erase. Deborah sat at the defense table, smaller than she'd ever looked. The pearls were still there, but they no longer gleamed. They seemed to choke her. On the plaintiff's side, our table was stacked high with evidence. The violation letters, Alan's testimony, the video of the chainsaws. Petitions signed by more than 2/3 of the neighborhood. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Her gavel cracked once. "This court has heard enough," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "We are here to render judgment." Rebecca rose, her tone measured but electric. She spoke not only of property law but of legacy. "Your Honor, this case is about more than a tree. It is about whether the memory of a fallen soldier can be reduced to a landscaping violation. It is about whether families who gave everything for this nation deserve to be bullied out of their dignity by a homeowners association." Then she lifted the bronze plaque, my father's name glinting under the fluorescent light, and placed it before the judge. "This is what they threw in the dirt." The judge's eyes lingered on it for a long moment before she turned to the defense. "Do you have anything to add?" Deborah's lawyer shuffled papers but found no words. Deborah herself sat rigid. Jaw clenched, her empire of intimidation collapsed into silence. The judge leaned forward. "Here is my ruling." She recounted the violations with surgical precision. The unauthorized destruction of private property, the falsification of HOA records, the intimidation of board members, and most damning of all, the desecration of a veteran memorial in direct violation of federal law. For these actions, the judge declared, the Willow Creek HOA is hereby ordered to pay full restitution to the Rodriguez family, amounting to $250,000 in damages, as well as the legal costs incurred. Furthermore, this court orders the immediate replanting of a memorial oak tree on the property, to be funded entirely by HOA reserves. That tree shall be accompanied by a permanent marker recognizing the sacrifice of Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, United States Army." The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Veterans in the back row straightened and saluted, some with tears glistening in their eyes, but the judgment did not stop there. "This court also finds evidence of willful misconduct by HOA leadership," the judge continued, her gaze pinning Deborah like a hawk's. "Accordingly, the matter is referred to federal prosecutors for further review under the Veterans Memorial Preservation Act. No one, not even an HOA president, is above the law." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed like justice itself. For a moment the room was utterly still. Then applause broke, rolling through the chamber like a wave. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, veterans clasped each other's shoulders. I turned to my mother. She was clutching the plaque, her knuckles white, tears spilling freely. But her smile, quiet, trembling, radiant, said everything. Outside, the courthouse steps had transformed into a celebration. Veterans unfurled a massive flag across the plaza. Neighbors gathered, cheering, chanting. Reporters shouted questions, but the only words that mattered came from Tom Henderson, his voice booming across the crowd. They thought they could cut down one tree. Today, the law planted a forest. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without the weight of fear pressing on my chest. Justice had been spoken, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to honor the man whose hands had once pressed roots into the earth with hope for the future. And soon, a new oak would rise. Spring came quietly, but in our neighborhood it arrived with the sound of shovels striking earth. The court had ordered one oak to be planted, but the town had other plans. On a Saturday morning, families gathered in the park at the edge of Willow Creek, each carrying a sapling. Veterans in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder with schoolchildren clutching gardening gloves too big for their hands. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now exchanged warm smiles and firm handshakes. By noon the field was alive with movement, soil turning, roots pressed gently into place, flags fluttering from stakes beside each sapling. Not one oak, but 100, one for every family who had felt silenced, one for every soldier who had given more than we could repay, one for every child who deserved to grow up in a community where memory was honored, not erased. As I pressed dirt around the roots of my own sapling, I thought of my father's voice. Low and steady, "One day this tree will give shade to your children's children." He had been right. The tree he planted was gone, but his promise had multiplied, spreading across the park like a living legacy. The ceremony ended with silence. Veterans saluted as taps played softly, the notes carrying into the sky. Then the crowd broke into applause, not thunderous, but steady like a heartbeat. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were a family, bound by struggle, loss, and a victory carved from unity. Months later, the transformation was undeniable. Where Deborah's reign of fear had left cracks, new trust had taken root. The HOA, rebuilt under new leadership, became transparent and accountable. The bylaws were rewritten to protect memorials, service flags, and veterans' families. Our neighborhood, once fractured, now carried a reputation of resilience. Property values didn't fall, they soared, and in the center of it all, the grove of oaks grew taller each day, their leaves whispering in the wind like a chorus of voices we thought we had lost. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I walked with my mother to the park. She touched the bronze plaque mounted at the entrance, her hand lingering over my father's name. Children ran between the trees, laughter echoing like bells. Families picnicked under the branches. For the first time, I realized we hadn't just rebuilt what was lost. We had created something larger, something that would outlive all of us. My father's sacrifice, our family's grief, the community's outrage, it had all become something more. Not just a battle against an HOA, but a victory for dignity, respect, and the memory of every fallen soldier. And now, dear friends, if you've stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you. These stories aren't just about rules or fines. They're about people, about families, about the sacrifices that shape this country. If you believe in justice, in memory, in the strength of community, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and let these stories remind us that even in the smallest suburbs, courage can change everything. From my family to yours, may you always find shade under the trees of memory. May your homes be filled with peace, your tables with laughter, and your hearts with love. Take care of yourselves, take care of your families, and may you always be blessed with health and happiness.